Welcome to episode 1 of Deep Weird. If you were just looking for a scary Halloween ghost story, you're in the right place. My name is Jacob Pittman, and for my entire life, I've been interested in the paranormal, the Fortean, the highly strange, and the unexplained. If it's weird, I'm interested in it. It doesn't matter if it's ghosts, aliens, Bigfoot, Appalachian goblin people, or the Mothman. Recently, I got tired of sitting on the sidelines when it comes to these kinds of topics, and I decided to get involved. I had a small online following that I could use as a jumping off point, so I put out the signal for people to send me their first-hand paranormal experiences. I didn't know what was going to come of it, but what happened was a massive outpouring of support and emails, and people willing to share their stories. For months, I have been interviewing these people behind the scenes, and now it's finally time to share their stories. For the next 12 weeks, myself and my co-host Olivia will be releasing these interviews along with a discussion portion where we discuss our thoughts, opinions, and how some of these stories relate to the broader paranormal lore. Today's experience comes to us from Monica, who lived what I would call a classic archetypal haunted house experience. This story has ghosts, Ouija boards, and tragedies, and I can't imagine a better first episode for Halloween or for this podcast in general. We're starting you off with an easy one before we get into the more bizarre stories that we have coming down the line. Thank you to Monica for being willing to share her story, and I'm gonna hand it off to her.
So my name is Monica. I used to go by the YouTube handle Darkovica, which I don't mind sharing. It's not, I have enough content on YouTube where either of those are pretty much dead giveaway. Like, you could look it up and I have too many videos. Not that they're successful, just it was a passion of mine, and I had a very small, sweet following that I have many good memories with. So that was a wonderful time of my life. I also, now I'm a stay-at-home mom, but I used to be a web developer. I graduated with a degree in game programming. So, and then I went into web design just out of, life hands you something, and then I went with it, and turned out I really liked it. So I did that for a really long time. And my husband is a game programmer. The game, I think, you know what? Never mind. I won't say. No, I'm allowed to say it. It's been announced. He's working on Killing Floor 3, so that's pretty cool. And so there's that. I have 2 kids. I have a cat. I love gaming. My favorite game right now is Final Fantasy 14. So that's taking up a lot of my attention. Well, I would say a lot of my attention is about like an hour in my day when my kids are asleep.
the 1 to 2 hours a day that you have for
exactly.
raising 2 kids. Yeah.
I have always pretty much believed in the paranormal, but like also been mildly skeptic, which is a very odd pairing. I always look at things like, I don't know how I feel about that, despite the fact that I've experienced a lot of really bizarre things. So it's like 2 warring sides in my head that kind of balance each other out a little bit, but at the same time are completely bonkers, because I'll be like, oh yeah, I went through all of this, and then I'll be like, yeah, but do I believe in orbs? Do you get what I mean?
Well, I feel like I've been sort of like, this is my first real project like in this space, but I've been involved in the paranormal community in one way or the other for basically my entire life.
Mm-hmm.
And every sane person in the community has the exact same dichotomy that you're talking about, where it's like,
okay, great.
Yeah, where it's like, I don't know what's going on, but
yeah,
it seems like something is going on.
Like, I've experienced something and I have 0 answers. That kind of thing. Like, I have no
you should always be skeptical. Mm-hmm. You should always be skeptical of somebody that claims to have answers for anything, really. So you emailed me with what could probably be described as like the classic haunted house story, which is great because I knew I was going to get at least one of these, and I was waiting for it to show up in my inbox at some point.
Awesome. I'm glad to deliver.
Yeah, so I mean, why don't you just like take it from the top? I usually like to stay out of the way in these interviews. So from this point forward, I'll probably just kind of let you like ramble. So if you just want to like start at the beginning and go through the entire thing, as best as you can, and then if something really bugs me, I might jump in and interrupt you for a question. But
sure.
I'll just kind of give you the floor at this point.
Okay, great. So this happened like almost 17 years ago. I must have been like 13 or 14. I was trying to remember the exact year, and I can't quite. I remember vaguely when we moved into that house, and my niece, who is important to the story, was 8 years younger than me, and we were like sisters, so we did everything together. We like grew up together pretty much, which is also important for the story, which is to explain why my niece, who is 8 years younger than me, was staying over the night with me in this brand new house that we were about to move into. Why would you hang out with someone who's 8 years younger than you? But we were just moving into this house that we had, been really excited about because it was really close to my high school. We liked the area. And I remember we asked my mom, and we were like, hey, we want to stay the night. It's going to be really cool. It could be spooky. Kind of the dumb teenager response where we were like, oh yeah, it'll be really spooky to stay there. But like not actually wanting it to be spooky, more like pretending it would be spooky. And so we stayed the night. We stayed in the living room, which is the central part to this story. So we stayed the entire night within this living room, and this is important. Into the living room, there were 2 exits, and both of those exits had like a pantry style doorway that would just swing open. It didn't have like a doorknob. It would just swing open and swing closed. And they were very secure. They were not super loose. They did not open on their own. We stayed there for at least 2 hours before I was finally like, do you want to use the Ouija board? Ouija, whatever. I've had people correct me both ways, and now I'm lost on if it's Ouija or Ouija. So,
just take the chaotic option and call it a spirit board.
There we go. Yeah, I'll go with spirit board. So I was like, you want to pull out the spirit board? And she was like, yeah. And so we thought we were super cool. We were going to pull out the spirit board. We were going to call in some spirits. We were going to be having a spooky night. The planchette never moved. So I want to get that out of the way. This was not that kind of spooky story where the planchette moved and demons were telling us we were going to die. No, it never moved. And we were like, oh, whatever. And we said goodbye, put the planchette and the board back into the box. I was very careful about that because I read the instructions because I was that kind of kid. And then we went back to what we were doing. We were just lounging in the living room. I had my PSP out. I was playing the game. I think it's called Wise. I've never actually heard anybody say that one. Wise. Yes. But yeah, I was playing that game and my sister was reading comics. And then this was the point where everything turned. So it started off with creaks in the house. And my sister would be like, do you hear that? And I was like, oh, we're just hyper aware now. That's why we're hearing this. Like, that's probably been happening all night. And she was like, oh, okay. And I'm sorry, I call her my sister. It was my niece. I need to get that out of the way. I call her my sister. We grew up together. She is my niece. But we interchange sister all the time because we're just that close. So she was in the room and reading her comic books, and the creaking is happening in the house, and we're ignoring that. And then the windows started kind of rattling in the other room, which was very dark. And so she was like, do you hear that? The windows are rattling. I was like, it's probably really windy. And we look out and the trees are not moving. There's no wind. This is I'm just going to say it's Los Angeles weather. There was no wind. It was just whatever. It was summer. It was whatever. No wind. And there was just nothing going on. So, we go back to what we're doing. I'm like, whatever. It's, we're just imagining it. We just pulled out a spirit board. There's nothing going on in this house. And then the doors started opening on their own. And at this point, I kind of I had always been told by my parents and my grandparents, who were very superstitious, that if you are afraid of it, if you acknowledge it, that it will get worse. So my brain processed this as don't acknowledge it. So I just went down the deep road of denial the rest of the night. And my sister was like, the doors are opening. And I was like, no, they're not. And I went over and I was like, they probably just need WD-40. And I like put a chair in front of them. And she was like, I don't think that's going to stop them. And I was like, yeah, well. And I went and sat down. And then there were like footsteps in the hallway. And she was like, do you hear that? And I was like, that's just the house creaking. You know, it's probably an old house. It's just settling. And she was like, I don't think so. And I was like, no, that's definitely just, you know, it's whatever. And then the other doors started opening that led from the living room into the kitchen. And I went and I was like, man, this house really needs some work. I put a chair up against those doors. And she was like, I think it's a ghost. I was like, it's not a ghost. And this kept going. Like, it just kept getting louder. The creaking in the house, the footsteps in the hallway. My sister was getting super anxious, super nervous. And like, I was just shutting it down. I remember at one point I took my PSP with that game because it had a jukebox mechanic, and I turned on the jukebox and I put it at max volume and started reading a book to drown out all of the sounds in the house. It was that loud. And my sister at this point was just sitting there looking around terrified. And then she was like, I need to go to the bathroom. And I was like, can't you hold it? She was like, no. So we got up and we went into what would be my parents' room. And their room had so it had its own bathroom, of course, and it had a sliding door that would eventually lead into what would be my room. And so that sliding door at that time was open. I think it led into a baby room, which is why that door was there, why it was connected between the parent room and a child room. So I remember I was standing in the bedroom while my sister was in the bathroom with the door cracked open because she was scared, and she had the light on in the bathroom. I remember that. And as I was standing there, I was looking into my room and I heard breathing, and it was very loud, and the room was very, very dark, which was odd because there were no curtains in that room. And I remember just kind of leaning forward and sliding the door shut. And my sister was like, why did you do that? And I was like, I didn't like looking in there. And she was like, what do you mean? And I was like, it was just weird. And she was like, okay. And then her light turned off in the bathroom and she started freaking out. She's like, did you do that? You did that. And I was like, I didn't do that, but it's probably just a faulty light. So I reached in and I remember flicking the light switch and it would not turn back on. And so she was like, okay, I'm done. And she like ran out of the bathroom. And I was like, it's whatever, you know, it's a new house. The dude probably just didn't change any of the lights. We knew very little about the person who had been selling the house at this point. We knew nothing. So we just had zero background on the people who owned the house before us. So all we knew is we saw a man before the house sale went through. So we went back into the living room, and eventually my sister got scared enough to make me call my parents to come back and stay with us. They were very upset. We did not tell them about the spirit board because we were afraid that we would get in trouble. We both agreed on this. That was obviously way more terrifying than potential spirits in the home was getting in trouble with my parents. So we basically, that was it. That was the end of that for the night. I don't know if just my parents coming in disrupted whatever was going on, but it completely cut out once they came in, and we were like, okay, great, we can go to sleep now. But the next day, when we started officially moving into the house and my parents were, you know, using step ladders and things like that, that was when weird things started happening again. Now, of course, we hadn't told my parents anything that had happened that night. My mom even remembers that we told her nothing because, again, we were afraid of being in trouble, like all dumb kids. And so we were obviously still paying attention to stuff and trying to pretend that nothing was going on, but still remembering that night. And I remember looking into the kitchen while my mom was complaining about the light in the ceiling. She kept saying, it won't turn on. It won't work. I just replaced the light bulb. And I remember looking at her, and she suddenly tipped off of the step ladder and she caught herself, and she was like, oh, that was weird. And I remember standing there like, oh my God, I've killed us. We're gonna die. I was like standing there literally like, this is it. I'm in a horror movie. We're getting pushed off ladders. Granted, it was a step ladder and it was like a foot off the ground, and my mom caught herself, thankfully. Now, my dad, I remember, was cleaning the gutters, and he was on an actual ladder, and he also fell off of the ladder, which was a lot scarier, but also explainable because my dad is horrifically clumsy, will hurt himself walking in a straight line. So again, nobody was really like, oh, this is really weird, except for me and my sister, who kept giving each other looks of terror. And so, eventually my mom even came up to me. We still hadn't told her anything. This was after like a week or two of being in this house. And she was like, a lot of weird stuff is happening. Things are disappearing. I wonder if this house is haunted, because my mom was a believer. And I was like, oh, who knows? Trying to pretend like I have no information on this subject. And I remember being so terrified that I did the pivotal horror movie thing, and I went online to look up answers on our old machine in the living room. And it was like, I could still see that forum. It had like a 90s wallpaper on it. It was it was straight out of a dumb movie. But it wasn't the first place I went to. It was just the first place that looked like it had any kind of know-how about what might be going on. And I remember looking up angry spirits, like don't know what to do kind of thing. And I remember this forum, there were a lot of posts, and they were talking about the potential reasons why a spirit might be angry. And some of the reasons that they were talking about might be that the spirit might not know it's dead. It might not understand why we don't know who it is. And it might also just be mad because we pulled it, away from wherever it was. So I remember looking at it, and they didn't really have a whole lot of answers. That was just what they were positing for why a spirit might be angry. So I remember I grabbed my sister and I was talking to her, and I was like, we have to fix this. And this was so dumb. We probably looked so dumb. When my parents weren't home, they went to go pick something up. We stood in front of our fireplace, and I was like, okay. I took her hands and I was like, look, I'm really sorry. I don't know how to send you back. I'm like 14 years old. She's 7. We're just kids. We don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to figure out who you are. So we're going to give you a name, and you're welcome to stay, I guess. And I'm going to call you Beethoven, which was, I don't know why it was Beethoven. That was just what we picked. And it was really bizarre because things took a 180 after that. Like, things started working, light bulbs started turning on. There were no more weird electrical problems. There was no more falling off step ladders. It was, things that were missing would appear in places that seemed way too obvious for us to have missed them, like on a kitchen counter, right in open view. It was very odd. So we just accepted it and moved on with our lives. And my mom was like, I swear there's something in this house. And we were like, oh yeah, sure. And unprovoked, our neighbor eventually approached my mom and asked if something weird was going on in the house. And my mom was like, why do you ask that? And she was like, well, you know what happened to the family before you. And my mom was like, no, pray tell. And, she explained that there was a lot of drama in the house, a lot of negative energy, and that it was a family, a man and his wife and their 2 kids. And the wife found out, she was very close friends with this neighbor, which is why the neighbor knew this. The wife found out that her husband was cheating on her with her best friend, and in the process decided that the only way to save this marriage was to get pregnant with another child, which I do not recommend. That was a terrible idea. Obviously did not save the marriage. If anything, probably made it worse. And so my mom told me, I had to double check this with her. My mom told me that what happened was she was driving and she suddenly started hemorrhaging. She just went straight into labor, a lot of blood, and panicked, was just terrified, and crashed into I think she said it was a sandwich shop, and just died. Neither her nor the baby made it. And so very soon after, the husband wanted to sell the house and move in with his girlfriend. So stand-up guy, real great. So real wonderful ending to the story. And we found out her name, which I can share. Her name was Donna. And I never, for whatever reason, I never told any of my friends about this, which is weird in itself because I'm not someone who really keeps this sort of thing quiet. Like, I love scary stuff, but maybe it was because it was so real that I was actually scared to talk about it and make it any more real. So I never told any of my friends that we used the spirit board, and I never told them anything about Donna. Not her name, not her backstory, not anything that happened in that house, even after my mom told me. And so much later, like the dumb teenager that I am, on Halloween, I had a little Halloween party and I had all my friends come over, and I thought it would be fun to pull out the spirit board again because I was a really, really, really dumb teenager. And so we pull out the spirit board and we're sitting there, and I didn't put this part in the email. This story is long and very intense, but we pull out the spirit board, and The planchette this time did move. The first couple times that we got a spirit may have been silly. It may have been one of us. It was just a very funny time. If we got anything at all, maybe it was our hands moving it. I don't know. It was just not serious. And then the final one was very, very different. The planchette did not move the same. There was no smooth movements. It was very slow. We almost had to write down the letters in order to hang on to it. And it moved jitteringly and sometimes sometimes fast, but none of us, there was no pressure on the planchette. I remember this. I remember sitting there and trying to look at our fingers and our hands, and there was no pressure. Half of us, our fingers were almost floating off of the planchette because we were so light. And I remember we were looking at it and we asked who was there, and it spelled out her name. And I remember it specifically spelled it out the way that she spelled it, which was a very bizarre way. I think it was Dhana. And I remember getting real quiet, and my friends looked at me and they were like, "What?" And I was like, "Who knows? Who did I tell?" And they were like, "What do you mean?" And I was like, "Who did I tell?" And they were like, "What are you talking about?" And my mom was like, "What's wrong?" And I was like, "Mom, it's Donna." And she was like, "No." And I was like, ask our neighbor. How does she spell her name?" And my mom ran off to go get the phone, and she came back and spelled it out exactly the same, which I think was Dhana. And I was like, no. I looked at my friends and I was like, "No, this one's real. This one, I don't know if we should keep going." And they were like, no, if it's real, we should keep going. And I was like, I don't know about that. And they're like, no, keep going. And so they asked her how she died. And it was very short. It was something like car. I don't remember this part exactly because I was so scared. And I really didn't want to go, but it wouldn't move without my hand on the planchette for a long time, which you might suggest that means that I was suggesting the movements either within, there's the argument that it is all psychosomatic and we're suggesting it, but I was watching my hand with that argument in my head, and just it felt like it was moving on its own. It just didn't feel like that. I remember it because I remember thinking that, am I doing this? Is this me? And it just wasn't. It's hard to explain unless you've felt it yourself, but it was just one of those things. And I remember it kept going for a long while. She explained, she said she had died in a car crash. Obviously, it very broken up, and it took a very long time to get these out. And I remember at the very end, she seemed to attach to one of my friends almost. My friend would ask a question and it would move much more energetically. And it got to the point where I was eyeballing this planchette, because one of the rules I remember in the instructions was that if it starts to go backwards in the alphabet, or it starts to do a circle, or it was backwards in the numbers, it's trying to create a portal. So I was eyeballing this planchette, and after a while, the friend of mine who was there, who was connecting, and she was like, "I don't know. I believe that it's all the husband's fault. He was a monster, and I think maybe this spirit, or it was a demon masquerading as Donna. It started feeding off of her and her negative emotions because she'd just gotten out of a relationship where someone had cheated on her. And I don't want to say too much information about her because obviously she's a real person. I just remember that when we asked, well, what do you want? She said revenge. And then the planchette started moving into a circle, and I moved the planchette real fast to goodbye, ripped it off the board, put the board away, and went, "We're done." And I've never touched a planchette, or I've never touched a Ouija board since. And the ending of this is not that. The ending of this is drawn out a much later, because over the next several months, the atmosphere in the house was just weird. It was tense. It was different. But it wasn't violent. Nothing weird happened after this. It was almost like we just sort of ghosted on in our lives. We were just, I don't want to say lingering, but just, it was very tense. And for whatever reason, we just stopped talking about it. We just never mentioned it again, which was, again, very odd for me. And maybe just, again, so scared that I just didn't want to make it real. And we ended up leaving the house and just didn't even talk about it while we were moving. And a month later, our old neighbor, sends my mom a picture. And I don't want to, obviously I won't share the photo because it would dox the house, but in front of the house was a priest with the family. They had called a priest to go over the house, to bless the house. Completely, they had no knowledge of it. We didn't tell anybody. The neighbor didn't tell them because she hadn't got around to meeting them yet. Nobody had any connection with these people. And we were like, oh my God, we forgot about Donna somehow, this spirit that made up a huge portion of our time living there. And we felt minorly guilty, but how do you talk about that after you have already moved out of the house? So that was the validation that we needed to prove that the entire thing was real, was that this family, completely unconnected to anything, we had told them nothing. They had a priest come to bless the house. So that's that. I mean, it's not the most violent story, but it was terrifying to go through it, I will say.
Do you think any of these other people that were involved would be willing to do an interview?
I'm sure one friend would, at least. I'll ask him. I can ask him. I'll ask him if he would like to.
I was able to get not only one, but two of Monica's friends that were present for this event to go on the record with interviews. So we are going to hear from both of them, and then we are going to head back to Monica's conclusion on the events, and then jump over to the discussion portion. So I'm going to hand it off to Jared.
My name is Jared. I am 32 years old. I have lived in California my entire life. I work at a tool distribution company, and I am a writer and an artist.
Had you heard anything about this alleged haunting prior to this incident? Had Monica, given you a briefing or, talked about any weird stuff going on in the house? Or did you have absolutely no idea about this going in?
Let's see. If I remember correctly, this was about 2009, Halloween of 2009. So at this point, I knew of the hauntings because Monica is the type of person that kind of just attracts these kind of supernatural oddities. So I've heard stories.
So what had you heard before that night?
Before that night, I believe Donna, if her name... Yeah, I think that was her name, Donna. She used to live in that house, and I believe she killed her husband. And Monica and her sister, Mariah, knew about the ghost because there would be just very random little hauntings that would end up happening. I think it was stuff like noises or something would move. And because they already knew about the history, they were able to put a name to it.
So why don't you just start at the beginning and tell me sort of what you remember from the Ouija board night?
If I remember correctly, it was 2009, possibly 2010. It was about our first year in college, and we were meeting up at Monica's place, either to go trick-or-treating or because we were just gathering together and having a little gathering there. Pretty sure it was trick-or-treating. I do not remember how we got to let's do the Ouija board, but I do remember we were in the garage. We ended up setting it up on one of those plastic tables, and I believe Monica was next to me at that point. So we ended up starting this. We ended up going through the rules. Don't let the cursor go from 9 to 0. Don't let it start going in circles completely. Otherwise, that is supposed to open a gate to hell. So we had to be completely aware of that, make sure that did not happen. So the first thing that we did is we called out for any spirits that might end up being around. And we did get one, which seemed very friendly at the time. I don't remember any of the details of how this person ended up dying and what they were holding on to, but we ended up guiding them to the light. We ended up asking them stuff like, do you see a light? Are you able to let go of your regrets, whatever's keeping you bound here? And everything seemed really great as soon as they moved on from what we are aware of. After that, we're all feeling good and we're like, let's try another one. So we get the second, and immediately we end up getting our resident ghost, which Monica was like, oh, we know about this one, let's be careful. I remember that the ghost, she had an affinity for our friend Ashley. Something about the way that they ended up feeling was resonating. I remember specifically the ghost had ended up saying that she was able to connect to Ashley because she did not take things for granted. That is the one thing that remained in my mind the entire time. But it always seemed like it was just a way to convince Ashley to actually help her and assist her in whatever revenge that she wanted. And she tried to open a gate. She did not care what would happen. She just wanted her revenge. And we ended up forcing a close. I remember Ashley being a complete train wreck right after that. And Monica was trying to stay very calm and collected about all of this because Ashley was having this huge breakdown. Yeah, that was about what I remember.
So, what do you think this was? What is your takeaway from this experience? Like, is this something you still think about, or is this something that you haven't considered in years?
It's something I haven't really considered in years. Like, I remember the experience if it's brought up at a random moment, which really is not often at all. But I've always been into the supernatural, so for me it's just like, oh, it's just another Tuesday.
And after this happened, do you ever remember hearing anything else about this from Monica specifically, or was it just kind of like this one event and then that was kind of the end of it?
It was mostly this one event, and that was the end of it. Definitely ended up hearing about how Ashley was reacting throughout the night, how scared she was, and hoping that nothing would end up happening to her. But other than that, I don't think I got much more details that I can recall.
My name is Melissa, and I work at a real estate company. I work the administration in the office, and I do the marketing and graphic design, as well as the transactions for the houses. Basically, that's what I do.
You were another person. You're the second person that I've talked to that was present for the now infamous in my life Ouija board story. Why don't you just kind of give your side of that story, and then I'll have a couple of follow-up questions.
Okay, so the details are a little vague now since it's been a while.
Right.
But I remember it was Halloween night, and we were sitting in the garage, and the garage door was open, and this is the first time that I had ever witnessed, a Ouija board, and it's the last time actually too for me. And I think I might have sat in. I never actually used it. I was sitting right next to observing, and I think they tried it once and it was very fast. And then the second time when I was there, that's when we got something that was very responsive, like answering questions. And I don't remember all the questions that were asked, but I remember them asking if they were a good person, and they said no. And somebody said something, well, it's subjective, along those lines. And whatever answered agreed with that. And then they asked what they did, and they said, I believe it's been a while, but I believe they said something along the lines of they murdered children. And after that, I think I kind of felt very uneasy after that. So after that, they got rid of it. And after that, I left to join other people who were giving out candy. So that's the only thing that I was witness of that event. then later I heard that it followed someone or got attached to someone. That's all I remember.
So at a certain point, the planchette on the board starts going in circles, and that's when they closed it for like the final, for like the end of the night. That's when they were done with it for the night. So you had walked away before that even happened?
Yes, I had. I had
Okay.
walked away and I was outside.
Okay, so you got freaked out by the stuff that happened before we even got to the stuff that pertains to like the main story.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah,
I
that's
think so.
interesting.
Uh-huh.
Um, but it's really interesting to get like everybody's sort of like, because you remember, and I think it's because it freaked you out so bad.
Mhm.
It seems like you remember more about what happened in sort of the first half of the Ouija board story,
Mhm.
because the other people that I've talked to, the first half has been kind of like not really that relevant, and then the second half is the one that they really focus on. So now I'm kind of putting
Okay.
together like the whole night here. What do you think about this? Is this something that you think about regularly? Is this something that you kind of forgot about? Has this like informed your life in any way?
I remember it because it was I think I was genuinely freaked out by the answers that it gave, and and I do remember that, but I don't remember a lot of details on everything. I and whenever I do tell the story, I keep it as vague as possible, you know?
So do you tend to lean towards kind of like the believer position in this, or do you think this is sort of a, because you know the traditional explanation for how Ouija board works is that it's a
Mhm.
like almost like a subconscious action of all the people around the table, or sort of like moving the planchette around without even really realizing what they're doing. Has this made you like more of a believer, or is it just like not enough to really move the needle on that?
You know, I'm not entirely sure. Actually, it's funny because someone who was also there, I remember him saying something along those lines of it being a subconscious thing. I remember him saying that after I had left. And, but it was really weird how everyone moved, like how it moved and it answered. I don't know. I'm kind of like on the fence on that, I think.
What do you think it was? What was your theory on this? How has this like affected the way that you go about your life on a daily basis?
So I haven't touched a spirit board since that night because I just got the funniest feeling that like, and this is going to sound so dumb and so cheesy, but it felt like something saw me that night. It felt like a red dot had appeared on my forehead, you know, like a sniper aim. And I've never, like, that feeling has never gone away. Like, it felt like something saw us that night. And I don't think any of my other friends who did it ever touched one ever again either. Um, it just, it affected all of us in a really, really intense way. I had two friends that night who refused to have anything to do with it, and they were probably the smartest people at that party. But yeah, I think that's definitely how that's affected me in my daily life. Is I don't mess around with spirit boards. I don't mess around with any of that stuff anymore because it just, like, when you're a kid, it sounds almost hokey, and like you want it to be real, but you're also kind of like hoping it's not real, but you know, it's fun to think if it could be real, and then it's real, and then you're like, "Oh, that's terrifying, and I wish I hadn't messed with this, and it's too late." And that's kind of how my mentality's been with that ever since.
So what is your theory on
Oh,
like
right.
what this is?
Sorry, I don't know, I forgot that one. I I'm not sure if what we got was really her, or if what we got was something that came through, or if it's something that she turned into. I mean, I've heard different theories over the years of different things, which is that, you know, maybe it was just a lost spirit who that we bothered, that we, you know, interrupted. What's the word I'm looking for? Whatever. We pestered her, and she came and was, there's a word for this, you know, her sleep was ruined. uh my brain's dying. I'm sorry. we bothered her, and she was just stuck on this plane now, and she was frustrated, and all she remembered was the pain of knowing that her husband was still going to leave her for her supposed best friend, and that she was pregnant with this baby, and God, the stress must have been what must have started such a horrible, tragic end to her life. And there's that's completely plausible, but there's also the theory that maybe if that was her, she could have been twisted by the anger that killed her and turned into something much more malicious. And there's also the idea that maybe towards the end, when on that Halloween party, it wasn't her that we were talking to. It could have been something lying and pretending to be her and having just enough information to be her, for all we know. So those are the three things that I've thought up, but I've never once doubted what happened that night. Like, I've never looked back and thought, maybe we imagined all of that, like, surely. You know what I mean? Like, there's never been a day where I through the fog of time, have looked back and thought, it was probably just a creaky house and stuff. Like, there was just feelings that we had. And I know feelings are not the best type of proof when it comes to the spiritual, but when you feel them, you realize it's just something that doesn't go away. It like embeds itself in your soul, and it's just terrifying. It's a really strange feeling.
All right, Olivia, welcome to the discussion portion of episode 1 of the podcast. This one, I know this is the 45th recording or whatever that we've done. I don't know how many we've done, but this is in fact episode 1. How you feeling? How you feeling about the show? How you feeling about the vibe? How have you enjoyed being part of these goofy little paranormal investigations that I'm doing?
There's quite a few good stories coming up. Stuff I had never heard about before.
So, with this story specifically, what is your experience with Ouija boards and spirit communication and poltergeists?
I've heard quite a bit about that sort of thing. I've never experienced any of it myself, really.
Yeah, you did. This is going to be the all-time callback. The die-hard listeners of this podcast that stick all the way to the end of our original run of 12 episodes will finally get the answer to this. I'm going to tease it. This is the series arc. I'm teasing it here in episode 1. You did see a goblin hand one time.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Now, think about what that means for the next 3 months. Let that cook for 3 months, and we'll tell you about the goblin hand. So, this story is really interesting because it pulls a lot of stuff that is like very well-worn paths in the poltergeist mythos, the Ouija board mythos, and it also feels very genuine. So, first of all, at the beginning of this, we have 2 young girls when this whole thing kicks off. And if you're familiar with the literature broadly, poltergeist activity really goes nuts for young women. This is a thing that people have talked about forever, and this has been a running trend in the historic cases, whether you're looking at the Enfield poltergeist in the UK or the Fox sisters in America, or if you really want to get crazy and go into the deep lore, Jeff the Talking Mongoose, the Bell Witch. All of these stories feature... Nobody fact-check me on the Bell Witch one, because I don't remember that one. But I think Jeff the Talking Mongoose, I think there's a small girl in that house. If I'm wrong on both of those, it won't be the first or last time. In modern cases, for example, the Otherworld podcast just did a 6-episode series called They, where the main thing going on in that podcast is some sort of poltergeist-like entity interacting with 3 separate women. Actually, I think 4 separate women. So this is a pretty well-worn path in the lore. Anybody's guess as to why this happens? 50% of the population are female, in fact, so it could just be a trick of the statistics. A lot of people have a bunch of honestly kind of outdated, somewhat sexist ideas that it's because women are more emotional during puberty and that is somehow attracting the spirits. I don't necessarily think that's true, but it's a trend that has been talked about. And one of the things that I like about this is how many like very, very, very specific details that are stuff that there's no way that you would think to put into the story if you were making up the story. Like in the beginning when she's talking about moving into the house, she's like, oh, I remember what game I was playing on my PSP. Which, like, what do you mean? Like, nobody under 30, first of all, even knows what a PSP is or was. So it's just such a this story is filled with so many like weird little details like that. Another thing that really lines up with the sort of archetypal haunting lore is that this story really kicks off when they're moving into a new house. And it is famously the case that when you are moving into or moving out of a house that is allegedly haunted, it gets the activity really picks up. Remember that, because that is going to be a key component of a 1 or 2 more episodes coming up. Another one is apportations, which is a word that you probably won't know if you don't follow paranormal stuff. An apportation, or read Harry Potter, God forbid, if you read Harry Potter, you might recognize that word. An apportation is when a physical object either just appears out of nowhere or disappears out of nowhere. In this case, I believe in the beginning of the interview, she's talking about how once they had kind of like put a name to the ghost and kind of calmed it down a little bit, that they started having these occurrences where objects they had lost would appear like in the middle of a counter or like right in the center of a room where like it would be very difficult to miss it, where there's no way that you just weren't looking at it, and that was a frequent thing. Even putting the name to the ghost is really interesting, because this is one of the first things anybody who is like legit in the paranormal world, if you come to them and you're like, listen, my house is haunted, I'm freaked out, what do I do? The first thing they'll tell you to do is be like, okay, this is going to be awkward, it's going to be weird, you're going to feel like you're a maniac, but just go wherever in your house the activity is the most common, whether it's like your living room or the bedroom or the basement or whatever, and just sit down and have like a discussion with the ghost out loud and set boundaries. Just say things like, hey, I don't really know what's going on here. I live here now. You can live here too, but you need to like respect me and stop doing the scary stuff. And I've even heard of some people saying like, here's the rooms that you're allowed in the house, and here's the rooms where you're not allowed in, like that kind of stuff. And so it makes sense that in this story, that was what Monica ran up against the first time that she started like Googling because she's about my age. So I know about what time frame this would have been when she was looking stuff up on the internet. And this is definitely advice that you would find quick. I don't want to get too bogged down on this in the first episode, because we're going to hit this really hard in many episodes coming up, that there is a lot of sort of questions about how much of this is real because it is real, quote unquote, and how much of this is real because it's what we believe is real. Like, what are the odds that every single time a house is haunted, all somebody has to do is like give the ghost a name and like talk to it? And then in some cultures, if you give the ghost a name, that actually gives it more power and makes it more dangerous. So like there's all these conflicting ideas, and I think the string that ties them all together is that the ghost is kind of haunting your mind more so than it's haunting your house. And some people who are not versed in this kind of stuff, who are uninitiated, as we say, will say, oh yeah, it's like all in your mind, you're making it up. But that's not what I mean. I don't think it's made up, but I do think it is in your head. And that is a sentiment that is going to get fleshed out the farther we get into the series. But for now, let's move on to the Ouija board stuff. Have you ever used a Ouija board, Olivia? Do you have any?
I have not.
Would you use one?
I think I would.
Yeah,
I'm not really scared of anything like that.
Should we get the boys together and do a Ouija board night?
Yeah.
So are you familiar with the traditional explanations for how Ouija board works?
Yeah, I know you can't put it away without saying goodbye.
No,
I mean, you're screwed.
I mean the skeptical argument for what's happening when you're using a Ouija board.
Oh, that like you're moving it or whatever.
Yeah.
With your hands, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
So the idea is that it's a group of people and everybody is sort of, they're barely touching it and they're sort of subconsciously moving it around.
Yeah.
And So, like, let's say you ask it a question and everybody in the group is thinking, like, oh my god, how fucked up would it be if it said yes to this question?
Yeah.
So everybody is sort of, like, moving towards... And that's been the kind of explanation. And one of the things that I like about this one is once they get to the Ouija board, they have a whole bunch of Ouija board ghosts, quote unquote, that come through on the board. And the entire time you get the impression when you're talking to Monica and when you're talking to Jared later in the other interview, you get this impression that they were kind of like goofing around. Like they were playing a game, they were doing like a little bit of a Halloween LARP. And this is so classic to like every Ouija board story you will ever hear. People will say, we got it out, we were messing around, we were doing a little bit of Halloween LARP, and then all of a sudden, the entire vibe shifted. And it felt different. Even though we all know how they work, it didn't feel like we were moving it. Like it for real felt different. One of the reasons why I decided to put this episode first is there's so many things that are like, this is archetypally a ghost story. This is the same story that we've all heard 100 times. And I wanted to get one of these classic ghost Ouija board poltergeist stories out first before we really start getting insane. Because let me tell you, there are some episodes coming up that are berserk. The whatever this is, the ghost, the poltergeist, the whatever, Donna, we get this other stereotypical idea of it feeding off the emotion, feeding off the vibe. So after they have the Ouija session and things get weird, Monica talks about how there was like kind of the house was like tense. And then it eventually culminates and it seems like them just like kind of forgetting about it until they move out. And this idea of the ghost feeding off the emotions in the house is a good one that has been around for a long time. So there's this idea that like, so the best example of what I'm about to say is at the very beginning of the story when she says, the light went out when all this other scary stuff was happening. And then when my mom went up to change the light, she was on the stool and she was trying to get the light out and the light bulb wouldn't work, even though it was a brand new light bulb. And she like almost fell out of the stool. From a skeptical perspective, it's like, yeah, the light bulb went out because the wiring was bad. The problem was the fixture and not the bulb. And that's why the light went out. And that's why your mom was frustrated trying to get the bulb to work. And then she was just messing around, not being careful on a stool or whatever, and like almost fell over. That could happen to anybody. Somebody right now is falling off of a stool trying to change a light bulb and harming themselves severely. Like statistically, that is currently happening right now. Somebody's losing their balance on a stool. But the thing about those kinds of situations is you're already paranoid about this other stuff that you can't explain. Then this thing that you can't explain comes along, but since you're paranoid, you hype that up as like, oh shit, this is like in there with the rest of the stuff. And then you get stuck in the situation where you can't tell the difference between the regular stuff that's a bad coincidence and the actual paranormal stuff. And you get caught in this like paranoid loop where it's an Ouroboros where the regular stuff that's just a little weird and a little scary feeds into the actual scary stuff, and then you can't tell the difference, and you get increasingly more paranoid and increasingly more freaked out. And there's something to be said there about, like, how much of that activity are you just manifesting by talking about it, and how much of it is real, and what does it even mean to be real? And what does it even mean to be real is going to be something that we talk about a lot in this series. So what do you think? What do you think about sort of the paranoid thought loops, some of these like classic ghost ideas?
I think the paranoid thought loops happen far more often than it's given credit for.
Yeah,
just
definitely.
from what I've heard of people telling me their experiences, a lot of it is like, okay, well, if you thought about it for like a little bit longer, it's probably not a ghost, but I understand why you would think it's a ghost.
Yeah, and so let's get into kind of the conclusion and the twist of this angle, where it's this lady named Donna who had this traumatic experience. And again, this is an absolutely like archetypal ghost story where it's like, okay, we had this person who had this traumatic experience, and now for some reason they're like living on as a spirit. There's a lot going on there. I personally don't think that ghosts are dead people. I think they are sort of a lingering cosmic memory of that person. And I think that if you die in a way that is particularly spectacular or upsetting or traumatizing, the universe is more likely to remember your death. This is going to sound insane, but I promise you in a couple of episodes it will make sense. So that part is completely sensical to me. The wild sort of ending where they've already moved out and their neighbor sends them that picture of the new family who moved in, blessing the house of the priest. On one hand, maybe they're just religious. Maybe they do that every time they move into a house. But on the other hand, it's like, okay, you had your neighbor come up and say, hey, you know what happened like before you moved in, right? And you being like, no, what's up? And then that independently validating all the experiences that you've had. And then you move out and another family moves in and they become the new family where like the stuff is happening. There's just so many instances of potential external validation in this between multiple parties who had no idea. And it's weird. Like this is one of those stories where, and this is one of the reasons that I picked it to be episode 1. Everybody has heard a story like this from somebody that they trust. Almost everybody is like, I've got an aunt, I've got an uncle, I've got a cousin, I've got a friend who swears, who is like a reasonable person. I trust them. They don't lie. They don't make shit up. They swear that this happened. And everybody has one of those stories. And I think that it would be dumb, unscientific, and intellectually dishonest to discount the fact that basically every single human on Earth has either like a first or second hand account of something like this happening. And this is a really good story to kind of dip our toes into, talk about some of this stuff from a sort of 1,000-foot view. What more can you ask for really than a classic ghost story with a beginning and a middle and an end? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Right, Olivia. I think this was... I feel like this first episode is just me kind of yelling, and that's true. Because I've got a lot of exciting stuff coming around the corner for you guys. And thank you to Monica for calling in, emailing in with this one. A lot of big stuff coming in the next few weeks. So every single week, this podcast is coming out, and we will see you there. Welcome to the outro segment of this episode. Hopefully you are still here. This is going to be a very important segment for future episodes. This is where I'm going to issue any corrections I made, share any thoughts that I forgot to mention in the discussion portion, give updates and teases to potential episodes, and all of that stuff. The one correction that I would like to make in this episode, or not really a correction, but kind of an observation. In the Jared interview, you'll notice that he couldn't quite remember what the tragedy was that this Donna ghost was involved in. And I almost forgot to even mention it. I only caught it last minute in editing. That was a really good example of how slippery the human mind and memory really is. If Jared's perspective was the only one I would have gotten, then this story would have had a much different tone. In terms of this episode, the only loose end here is that I would really like to get an interview with Monica's mom and Monica's niece. We've talked about it. We think her mom might be open. Her niece is in the military, which makes things a little bit difficult. But if at any point I get interviews with them, there will definitely be a follow-up episode to this one. If you have a paranormal experience that you would like to share on the show, please email us at deep.weird@gmail.com. And if you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a 5-star review wherever you can. That goes a long way to getting the podcast out. And with that said, this podcast was written and produced by me, Jacob Pittman, and the wonderful music that you've been hearing throughout was produced by Griffin Dodefray. Thank you for listening. Thank you, Monica, again for sharing, and we'll see you next week.